Hey everybody, I'm Nick Layton.
And I'm Leah Bottima.
And we're the hosts of Were You Raised by Wolves?
Each week we try to make the world a kinder, nicer place.
Well, that's the idea, at least.
I mean, we try.
Have you ever wondered what to do if you're ghosted?
Or what to do when a friend asks you to borrow money?
Or the proper way to eat Cheetos?
You know, the big questions.
So please find Were You Raised by Wolves wherever you listen.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
This episode is brought to you by the second annual Catskill Cuisine Festival. Visit catskill-cuisine.com to learn more and buy tickets.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. Since 2009, HRN podcasts have been exploring the wide world of food, beverage, and agriculture. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
This is Gastronomica, a Heritage Radio Network podcast. I'm your host for today, Bob Valgenti. This series is produced in collaboration with Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies. This week, we offer a peek into Gastronomica's next issue, Summer 2024, coming soon. Author Evelyn Lambeth, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania and honorary fellow at Australian National University, joins us to discuss her research on meat and the historical legacies of modern food systems in Australia. Her newest article, forthcoming in Gastronomica, is titled Settler Colonial Classifications of Edibility. Evelyn, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Okay, so why don't we start with a little bit of background? Can you tell us how you became interested in this issue of meat consumption in Australia? Both how it interests you as a scholar, but perhaps more importantly, how it ties into your own broader interests.
Yeah, so growing up sort of near New Orleans, I think about food a lot. I've always thought about food a lot. And when I immigrated to Australia, I had all my expectations about what the kangaroos were doing here, but none of those were really met. I saw a lot of them as roadkill. I saw them in native zoos, but no one was eating them. They were sort of everywhere and nowhere on the national emblem, but sort of cutified in people's minds. So it just got me into thinking about food more broadly. There was a lot of beef, a lot of mutton, but no wallaby or kangaroo on the menu. So that sort of led me into getting a history degree, and I took a food history course, and my now current supervisor was really brilliant in just showing me that food could be a lens from which to study history, and that was brilliant to me. And it sort of ties into food crosses so many spaces. It's classed, it's gendered, it's political, it's visceral. It sort of ties into all of my broader interests that I can put into scholarship more generally.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that personal side of the history, though? Because we'll get into some of the methodologies that you employ in the paper, which are really quite interesting and cross-disciplinary. But as an eater, it seemed like your first reflections on this issue came from that very basic question of when you're in a new place, what am I going to eat and why is it somewhat different? Is there something particular about the Australian foodscape that made that stand out to you? Or was this a question that you maybe already had imported with you, thinking about the different things that you either ate or didn't eat when you were growing up in Louisiana?
Yeah, I guess both. In Louisiana, we're really well known for eating alligator, squirrels. We eat according to the land, and that's just how I've grown up, and sort of my value-based living that I try and emulate wherever I am geographically. So when I got to Australia, it was really interesting to me that the entire menu seemed to be imported from a colonial mindset. Those animals that were important to British palates had definitely made their way onto the Australian radar. And I guess from an eating standpoint, I mean, I think we appreciate and value what we eat, as weird as that sounds. If we are cognizant of it being a resource, we tend to manage it a little bit better. So I was really interested, if the wallabies and kangaroos weren't on the menu, then where were they? And that was pretty enlightening, and really sparked my interest in how I go about my research.
Yeah, so could you tell us more about that methodology? Because you start from, let's say, a historical standpoint, but you also bring in legal scholarship. It involves a good deal of zoology, agricultural practices, and even textual analyses of cookbooks and other sources. So it's what makes your work so rich and interesting. So is that something that you initially brought to the subject, or was it something that seemed to evolve naturally as you got deeper into the research?
Probably a bit more of the latter. Not finding them on menus. Most food historians, that's their first go-to, is looking at a cookbook, looking at what people are literally putting on the menu. But because wallaby and kangaroo consumption wasn't legalized until the late 20th century in Australia, I had to go into historical methodologies to find those. So it was digging through archives and looking at colonial settlers, what they ate, how they talked about food, all of the native animals they consumed. And then it got into bringing over the British mindset of treating animals as property. Naturally led me into legal scholarship, which then led me more into geography and how spaces are organized both legally and socially. And so it's sort of all interconnected, which is nice for my research because I get to grapple with a lot of different methodologies and scopes.
Yeah, and it seems that it all sort of coalesces on the plate, or in the case with some of the things that you're looking at, it doesn't coalesce on the plate, and that's where that question mark emerges. But with all those sources and all the different threads that you're following, I was impressed as a reader at how focused your argument is. So I just wanted to take this from your essay. You propose that, and this is just to quote what you say, the evolution of settler colonial institutions in Tasmania continues to escalate climate change, maintain hunger, and structurally exclude, end quote. So your argument focuses not only on the history of actions, but their continued and their problematic legacy. And this is, I think, why your work is so important. So could you help us piece this legacy together a little bit? How does the problematic legacy begin? And then how does that develop so that we can maybe take each of these? There's the climate change piece, there's the hunger piece, and then there's, of course, the structural inequality that's there as well.
Yeah. So I'm sure I don't know if people do know this actually. I didn't know this until I moved here, but Australia was settled. Settler colonialism is its own really niche point of imperialism, but then within that, Australia was settled as a penal colony. So the British Empire sent a lot of convicts, both Irish, Scottish, and British convicts, over to Australia, and they were very unfamiliar with the native food sources here, I guess you could say. They didn't know the animals. They'd never seen them before. They didn't know any of the non-meat items either. They couldn't grow very much. It's a very different climate. So from an historical lens, they imported a lot of animals, but those animals weren't suited to an Australian climate, and it took a while. Eventually they did, pull up the trees, plant species that cattle and lamb could eat for a burgeoning wool industry as well, but they still had to consume within that. So historically, bushranger goes to a white colonial settler that would go out, escape their penal institution, mostly out of hunger. Sometimes the institutions would hire them and pay them because they also needed to feed the rest of the convict settlement. So they would go into the bush and shoot native animals, bring dogs. They brought dogs to kill native animals. They started eating this pretty early on. But once the, land settlements, more people came, more animals came, acclimatization societies, they really were trying to remake English counties, gardens, create familiar settings in an unfamiliar terrain. And so they started to weaponize the law to facilitate that. They set up fences, made it illegal to cross boundaries. Of course, wallabies and kangaroos hop, so that confused the narrative a bit there. But more importantly, they criminalized Aboriginal Australians' access to their own food sources. And that's that bit that is really manifested today in structurally excluding First Nations peoples from food sovereignty based on how the British treat animals as property. So the people that were given huge settlements in the colonial period largely still own the animals, because if you own land, you own the animals. That's how native animals are managed. And most of the killing for wallaby and kangaroos happens to protect cattle and introduced species, cattle and sheep more specifically, but they're treated and managed as a pest species. So if you get, if you own the land, you own the animal, but you can shoot them if they cause a disturbance to your main resource. So it's based in wealth, it's based in class, and it's based in this idea that the native species here are problematic.
So we have a sort of a beginning of the process that then gets legalized, turned into structure, turned into practice, and then, as we can perhaps talk about in a little bit, it also gets turned into a sort of, if it's the right term, but a mythicization of creatures like the kangaroo, who sort of become protected from any kind of edibility by the sort of more idealistic role that they play. But I want to go back first. You mentioned in passing this term acclimatization. And it seems to be a term that is operative in your essay in a number of ways. And it seems to be powerful because it has not just to do, obviously, with the natural climate, but also a kind of cultural and legal and social climate that's there. So could you say more about that and how that maybe to bring out a little bit the extent to which that emerges from circumstances at the beginning of this colonial process, but then obviously takes on not only intended, but also perhaps some unintended consequences as well.
Yeah, that was also a new term to me, but it's quite useful both in its, if you treat it as a noun, as a verb, as a way of being. But acclimatization societies had, before the term was utilized, they were already moving species across the globe, both flora and fauna. And if you read the historical accounts, they tried to bring manatees. They tried to bring, zebras, tigers, monkeys. We had monkeys in Hobart in the mid-19th century. But when it really became an official process in Tassie, a little bit earlier on the mainland of Australia, 1862, they developed their first acclimatization society. It was based in zoologists, Royal Society, Joseph Banks, the people that, the scientists, the natural scientists that studied the flora and fauna of wherever they were traveling. But from an acclimatization standpoint, when you develop a settler colonial society, you're still expected to produce for the empire, so the mother country in this sense. So they needed to produce wool, they needed to produce beef, they needed to produce resources and staples that the British wanted to consume. So they started introducing, grass species, lucerne, things that could grow well to feed certain animal species. But within that, the acclimatization is interesting because when First Nations ontologies and epistemologies had been managing their native species for millennia, hundreds and thousands of years. When you quickly change all of that infrastructure in the matter of a century, there are a lot of unintended consequences, and how the animal species, they have agency. We can, as humans, change things, but everyone's interacting all the time. There's a lot of interspecies entanglements that manifest. So in you rip up trees, you plant new grass. Kangaroos and wallabies are also, they have 4 stomach fermenters. They eat what cattle eat. So they then became a nuisance because they were eating all of the resources that were planted for sheep and cattle. So the unintended consequences there is that they multiplied in numbers, which was an unintended consequence of acclimatization. But more so, when you start to bring flora and fauna, you have all of the other nuisance species. So blight and microorganisms, all the things that were never intended to be in new places, you start bringing those around the globe. And there's a lot of interesting consequences that manifest.
Yeah, so and of course, Australia is its own, noted for its unique flora and fauna as well. So its own evolutionary history is part of those entanglements. So, the other term you bring up is this notion from Alfred Crosby of ecological imperialism. So this idea of exporting the empire and trying to make these new places, in a certain sense, not only provide for, but to have them exist in the image of the empire itself. Is there something, there's a way in which this story gets played out, and unfortunately in many places, both on the human scale and on the broader ecological scale. Is there something unique, though, about Australia, whether it's in its social or in its natural environment, that made it particularly either problematic or dangerous, or even just interesting in this sense? Is there an aspect to this story of acclimatization and ecological imperialism that is uniquely Australian that you capture in your research?
I think the nature of marsupials is quite interesting in Australia. There's, of course, from Pangaea, there's marsupials in South America, but not to the extent that they are in Australia. Like the native animals and plants here are some of the most unique in the world. And it's also the second driest continent landmass outside of Antarctica. So what we've gotten away with in terms of water and salinity in other continents is exacerbated quite intensively here. And as far as settler colonies go, in a matter of 200 years, we have the highest rate of extinction for native species in the world. And so I think the interesting point here is that Australia is still treated as a tourist destination, and people want to come here to see the native flora and fauna, but the reality of how we maintain it is just the antithesis of that. So there's all these unique, seemingly oxymoronic ways that we go about managing such a unique ecosystem.
Well, why don't we pause on that moment? There's a lot more to talk. We'll take a short break, and then we'll be back in just a moment.
Gather your friends and family at the second annual Catskill Cuisine Festival, presented by the Sullivan Catskills Visitors Association, Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, and Resorts World Catskills. Mark your calendars for a flavor-packed weekend from May 10th to May 12th. Experience the fusion of phenomenal food and electrifying entertainment. Rub shoulders with your favorite Food Network personalities, including Andrew Zimmern, Michael Simon, Scott Conant, Marcus Samuelson, Jeffrey Zakarian, Anne Burrell, Melba Wilson, and distinguished international chefs by LaBelle Farms. Kick off the festivities with Friday's star-studded golf tournament and evening reception. Saturday heats up with free tastings, thrilling live demos, music, and family activities, culminating with a gourmet dinner hosted by celebrity chefs. And on Sunday, celebrate Mother's Day with a special celebrity-curated brunch. Tickets for this celebration are selling like hotcakes. Visit catskill-cuisine.com to grab your pass for this unforgettable weekend in the picturesque Catskills. See you there!
And we're back. This is Gastronomica on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Bob Valgenti, talking with Evelyn Lambeth about settler colonial classifications of edibility, forthcoming in Gastronomica's next issue, 24.2. So maybe now that we're back from the break, I wanted to raise a question related to Heritage Radio's theme for the month of May, which is adaptation. So when we hear the word adaptation, we most often think of some kind of change or transformation responsive to specific conditions or environments. But the real work of adaptation usually seems to come after, when the successful changes work and become normalized and habitual, so much so that they seem natural or just the way that things have always been. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon of things becoming normalized or naturalized? At a time when it seems clear that we need to change our practices as a society and as a species, is historical work like yours one of the ways that we remind people that we have adapted in the past, for better or for worse, and can do so again? Or maybe another way of framing the question is, when you undertake a historical examination like this, is there a hope that you find in telling these stories, even though the history itself is rather quite tragic?
That's a really interesting question. I think that's part of why I'm so attracted to history as a discipline. I think deep understanding of how we've adapted. It's interesting that you applied successful to that. Maybe I would argue that it hasn't been so successful, but I think
Point taken.
I think I think highlighting some of the ways we've tried to alter and homogenize, particularly through globalization, and some of the bigger contemporary issues we're facing because of those adaptations, i.e., I'm thinking zoonotic diseases, massive transportation issues, things like COVID, when our seemingly successful adaptive modernity gets really disrupted. I think those are moments that, as an historian, are really nice to be able to pause and reflect and slow down and think back to how we got to be at this point now, and maybe consider within that lens how we can do better, which is, of course, we're always trying to grow and learn. And we inherently are adaptive creatures. We can learn from our mistakes if we are not so stubborn, which I think there's just a shift I can feel currently where people are really starting to question. And those questions, I think, are going to lead us into just thinking how we can do things differently, adapt again, readapt, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and of course, edibility is at the heart of this, right? Because edibility isn't just a matter of chemistry or biology. It's a real cultural idea of what we find to be either appealing to eat or what generates disgust in some way. So this is such a part of what you describe in the essay, is that along with these kind of massive changes that happen in that process of acclimatization, there's also this social campaign to take certain things off of the menu, or to give them perhaps a place within the social imaginary that is not as the edible. So could you talk a little bit about that? Because the backside of that, of course, is, and this is perhaps a question, it's a question that I have and perhaps others might have when they read your essay, is if we change our notions of edibility, particularly to address climate change and other issues, if we interact with certain species in a way that perhaps is better for the natural environment in which they were originally found, do we have to then, or how do we go about recategorizing animals that we've seen as friendly or as non-edible? Do they become edible again, or do we shift altogether in a different way, or how does that play out?
That's a great question. I think people would be maybe shocked to think about the fact that the kangaroo is this emblematic species in Australia. It's cute. It's on television shows, et cetera, et cetera. It's in all the zoos across the lands. But most kangaroo is shot and consumed by other animals. It's a massive meat in the pet food industry. And I think maybe the question when we start to tease out what is edible, maybe to reframe it as who is eating our animals is a really interesting question. The idea that I guess a lot of the climatic issues are the fact that we have domesticated species that are then reliant on us as humans and vice versa. When you feed something else to feed it to something else, there's a lot of work involved in that. So thinking through edibility in that sense, if you're going to feed it to your animals, I think it's also, edible to you. So the literal definition of edible, but if something can care for itself, feed itself in the land that it was intended to be in. And I don't know, I think it would just encourage us to think of nature as a living resource in that sense versus something to be controlled, where we just get into a more natural rhythm of seasons and flow and how, get back to our animal natures of we eat to nourish, we don't eat to exclude.
Yeah, and it seems what's fascinating and essential about the work that you're doing before we can even take that step forward, or to do so mindfully, requires that we understand how we got to this point. And that is a bit of a reckoning, of course, with practices that not only have occurred in the past, but that continue to have ramifications and are difficult to extricate ourselves from. And to a certain extent, we find ourselves implicit. And of course, the story is not just how we've managed the environment or how we've managed those particular animals, but it has ramifications for all aspects of human society as well, particularly those who have in certain ways either been neglected or treated with indifference because of those policies. So I wonder if you could share with us perhaps what maybe surprised you the most about your research. I think many who are going to read this are going to be fascinated, just from everything from descriptions of cookbooks and recipes to just the scope of the entire history that you outlay. But what fascinated or surprised you the most as you undertook this research?
So many things. I think the law was a really interesting point of my research. I never thought I would study legal history, but I think punishment is really unique. And of course, I didn't think I'd relate edibility to how we exclude within that from a legal standpoint. But one of the things that I found while I was reading legal documents for the commercial saleability of wallaby, it stipulates that when you shoot a wallaby, if there's a baby in the mother's pouch, you also have to kill the baby. And that image just really, I don't know, I couldn't unthink it. And it really motivated me to do this sort of work. It's one thing to read that in a legal setting, but then when you put that to a statistic, how many baby joeys are killed every year to just based on the law, it just seems there's so much waste that is ingrained in how we structure society. And I think that was really illuminating for me.
Yeah, and that seems to be, in some ways, one of those unintended consequences, or perhaps a feature of those processes that began long ago, just to attempt to make the new land in the image of the land that settlers came from. So perhaps as we're getting towards the end of our time here together, could you share with us a little bit about either the future of this project or the project that you're working on now?
Yeah, I am now researching pigs, but because I'm based in Australia, I'm never going to go very far from the kangaroo. It's a pretty integral part of the food ecosystem here. But pigs are really interesting now because I really want to tease out that larger question of how we treat other species inevitably impacts how we treat ourselves. And yeah, I knew from an historical side of things, it can be quite depressing just to focus on the human for your whole career. So I think studying animals is a really interesting way to bring food and, sort of all of the transdisciplinary approaches that I did in this research. I hope to incorporate in a lot of my further research. But I think going into the future, I'm really interested in how we can use social and cultural institutions to bring about greater change, working across an academic setting with museums, engaging art. There's a lot of people that are really passionate about making change in society, and I want to try and link a few of those together because I think that's where really impactful change happens.
Yeah, and with that kind of outreach, of course, since we're a podcast and an entire podcast network about that deals with food, food is oftentimes one of the ways not only that you could draw people into a conversation because you could share food with them, but it's one of those. Food is a phenomena that has so many ramifications across the board. So it's oftentimes an easy point of contact to relate with people. But have you found in this case, because you're talking about foods that are preferred and perhaps familiar to an entire population, that this discourse about rethinking the food system and how we manage the species that are part of it. Has that been difficult? Or, as you've done any kind of outreach or conversations with either colleagues or people outside of academia, is this a tough sell, or is this something that you think people have a desire to hear these days?
The desire point there is very funny. I guess something that's come up a bit with researching industrial animal agriculture is sort of a different play there when you eat wild meat versus domesticated species. But I guess this is a bit of a trigger warning, but some of the things that have come up really recently in my research, everyone knows Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, 1906. He was talking about the Chicago meatpacking industry. But I think, again, what people missed from that, the saying goes, he aimed for people's heart and he hit them in the stomach. They took food safety out of that, not so much the labor issues that he was trying to get at. No, he was writing about a Lithuanian family who was, immigrants who didn't have a lot of agency in where they were working, who were exposed to all these horrific conditions. And when the modern take of that, it's called the Sinclair effect, but 70% of abattoir and slaughterhouse workers are immigrant populations who there's a direct correlation between domestic violence and slaughterhouse workers. And I think when I have all these conversations with people, of course, I'm talking about meat right now as the edible food source. But, when a vegetarian's like, oh, I'm a vegetarian, therefore it doesn't affect me. But when you draw in the human population, it's starting to click a little bit more. So I think with a lot of my research, it's about eating, but it's also about how we care for others within how we eat. And I think that is what I'm trying to get across with some of my research.
Yeah, I think that was something that you mentioned before. How we treat the animals around us, reflects greatly on how we treat each other. I think that seems to be one of the strong messages that are here. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great talking to you and talking about your research.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Evelyn. Listeners will find the full essay in issue 24.2 of Gastronomica, the Journal for Food Studies, coming out soon. For details, visit gastronomica.org. Join us again next week as we talk with Bronwyn Polyket about food system change and co-producing planetary eating futures from Dakar. And don't forget to subscribe to the Gastronomica podcast feed on your favorite platform to stay updated on our newest episodes this season.
This show is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.
Hey, it's Francis Lamb, host of The Splendid Table. Every week on our show, we talk about food and cooking and the meanings of food and cooking. We talk with the most interesting people in food about their techniques, their culture, and everything in between. Whether it's about how fried chicken took over the world or how Instagram changes the way people are actually eating. It's a food show where everyone is welcome. Come join us. You can listen to The Splendid Table wherever you get your podcasts.